Another loss to the Winnipeg Jets for the Minnesota Wild. What can we learn from the loss as the Wild have a big game coming up on Friday against the Panthers? We discuss today on Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen every day. And just as a reminder, Locked on Wild is free and available wherever you listen to podcasts. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we take the Winnipeg Jets loss for the Minnesota Wild, come up with some ways the team can avoid a similar performance against Jets-like teams going forward, and a few tweaks to the lineup that may help the Wild with a big game against the Panthers coming up on Friday. My name is Seth Topal, host of Locked on Wild, veteran Minnesota sports content producer, and the captain of Locked on Wild. Happy to be with you here on a Thursday edition of the show. And let's get it out of the way. That was not a fun game last night for the Minnesota Wild against the Winnipeg Jets. 6-3, the final score. A game in which the Wilds had plenty of opportunities. Connor Hellebuyck gave the Wilds plenty of opportunities to keep it close and to potentially come away with the win. But some rare off-night performances for the Minnesota Wild in the defense department. Really not a good night for the defense, and they certainly did Cam Talbot no favors in that game. And one of the rare times, too, that the Kaprizov line and the Fiala line both kind of kept in check throughout the course of the night. So some interesting things, and I think still, despite the fact that the Wild have lost now twice to the Winnipeg Jets, and those are the only two regulation losses in their last 14 games, I think there are some things that we can take away from this game, and I know last time this happened, first game of the second half, really just kind of swept it to the side as, Wild didn't play well. They were sluggish. They were slow out of the gate. And, despite a great goalie performance by Kaapo Kähkönen, the Wild ended up losing that game. Now tonight, some things to take away from this game moving forward for this team, because somebody on the previous recap of the Jets loss mentioned that it seemed like Winnipeg had kind of the book on how to contend with the Minnesota Wild, and while some of that was a pretty glaring loss of Matt Dumba that has just thrown the defense out of whack, there is some truth to that, because it does seem like, for whatever reason, the Winnipeg Jets this year are the team that just has had some success, especially in Winnipeg, against this Wild team. Now, nothing to get super panicked about, I don't think, because at the end of the day, it's two games against the Jets that the Wild have not looked particularly good. But it is a Jets team that plays a much slower style hockey than the Minnesota Wild are used to, and it's clear in these two games against the Jets that the Wild played down to that Winnipeg style, and just had some sloppy passing for the Wild that led to some opportunities for the Jets. A disastrous night in the face-off circle in the first matchup between these two teams. Now, in tonight's game, it wasn't nearly as bad. It seemed like the Jets took a little bit of the previous Minnesota Wild style and really tried to lull the Wild to sleep. And if you can find a way to slow down Kirill Kaprizov, Matt Zuccarello, and Ryan Hartman, and Kevin Fiala, Matt Boldy, and Freddie Gaudreau, well, then you got to like your odds against this team at any given night. And I think it is something that we just have not seen a team be able to do here that often. Even some of the upper echelon teams, looking at the Carolina Hurricanes, who just were able to take the Florida Panthers into overtime. The Panthers did end up winning that game, but one of the best teams in the Eastern Conference, the Wilds, they showed that second line has the depth scoring to carry this team. And the Jets, despite them being a floundering 500 team, the Jets have the makeup, I think, that can just do enough to throw this Wild team off off their bearings. So our purpose, our goal, our objective here for today's episode is to just look at some of the things that went wrong and to try to come up with some ways to combat that and to not run into this the next time the Wild play a team similar to the Jets that's physical and is able to frustrate and just kind of throw off their game, the top two lines that this team has. So obviously, first and foremost, it did seem like the team kind of let their foot off the gas a little bit. They did have the 1-0 lead, and it seemed like after that, Winnipeg was the team that was doing all of the team that had all of the earnest in their offensive game. The Wild after that just seemed like they kind of they were just off a step. It seemed through pretty much the entirety of the night, and defensively, that's as confused as I've seen those D pairings look in quite some time. And so, you look at Cam Talbot's performance here this evening, last night, I should say, and some of that's on him, certainly, but that defense in front of him did not do him any favors in the game. And a lot of rebound attempts right out in front of the net, a couple of tap-in goals for Mark Scheifele, and it just seems like the Wilds kind of got stuck in neutral, and the Jets were able to capitalize off of that. And by the time the Wild were able to get back into first gear, it was just too late. You're down 4-1 to start the third period. And, the Wild did get that second goal. But at that point, then the Jets answered. The Wilds got an empty net goal, but then the Jets got an empty netter of their own. So it seemed like by the time the Wild went back into attack mode, there was not enough time for them to make the comeback. And the Jets at that point were basically playing with house money. So anytime the Wild made a counterpunch, the Jets were able to just immediately answer it. And so, it's not the end of the world. It is a disappointing performance because it felt like a game right in the get-go, despite the Wild not playing their best. That was definitely winnable because, again, Connor Hellebuyck single-handedly tried to give the game away on 4 different instances. One, the Jordan Greenway shot that was deflected and ended up missing the net. I understand what Jordan Greenway was trying to do there, but if Greenway just simply adjusts even a little bit and goes top shelf, he's got a goal because Hellebuyck just could not help himself coming out of the net to try to play the puck. And so that instance, the Jets got lucky that the Wilds didn't get one in. Kaprizov nearly had one of those as well early on in the game. Hellebuyck again coming out of the net to play the puck and just does not get back between the pipes with enough intensity to get back before Kaprizov fires off a shot that just misses. He was a little too deep towards the boards on that shot to do anything with it. And so, you look at this game and you look at both of these Winnipeg Jets games, and despite the Wild not playing particularly well, a good portion of which was due to what the Jets were doing against them, which was just being, being physical and being a pain and playing a style of hockey very reminiscent of what the Minnesota Wild played before they kind of started this tonal shift towards more of an offense orientation. A lot of what the Jets have done to the Wild over these two games, the Wild still had plenty of chances to be in both of these games, and so I think that's part of the frustrating thing too, is that these two losses could very easily have been wins depending on how things play out, and if the team can just kind of keep that intensity going as opposed to just letting their foot off the gas. So a disappointing loss, but I think a lot of what the Wild did is fixable. We're going to start by looking at these D pairings for the Wild, which were just not working against Winnipeg, and so we'll look at those and we'll try to figure out something that the Wild can do in the interim to try to get a little more consistent performance defensively. More to recap the Wild's loss to the Winnipeg Jets coming up next here on Locked On Wild. Football might be over for the season, but basketball is in full steam for both pro and college hoops. From all the latest odds, totals, player performance props, to where the next fired coach is going to land, BetOnline.net is the number one spot for all of your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your source for hockey, boxing, and UFC odds, right to the Olympic coverage and information. So head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. You can find all of that at BetOnline, where the game starts. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild, and again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. The numbers continue to come in, and I want to give a shout out to the YouTube crowd as well. Don't get a chance necessarily to respond to all the comments, but we're getting a nice, healthy little Locked On Wild community that is starting to take over the comment section. So love to see that and love to see the back and forth between listeners. We appreciate what each and every one of you bring to this group that listens to the show on a daily basis. So in looking past the Winnipeg Jets game, which, pun intended, because that seems kind of like what the Wild did, in looking forward is probably a better way to put it. From this game to the Florida Panthers game coming up on Friday, and we'll have Armando Velez of Locked On Florida Panthers on for a preview for Friday. We gotta do something about those D pairings, because that was just I know the numbers say that that the Jared Spurgeon Jonas Brodin pairing was good, but I don't know if you can put those two together just for the sake of having that one dominant D pairing and just leave everything else kind of to chance. And Brett Marshall, friend of the show, host of the Sound the Foghorn podcast, does player performance cards on Twitter. And so I'm going to reference what he put together to just kind of take a look at what some of these pairings have done over the last couple of games. And this all stems back to Matt Dumba in the game against the Carolina Hurricanes, not playing since then, and actually his injury happened in practice. So that was the last game that we had the normal pairings on defense, and that coincidentally was a game in which Jordie Benn did not play. And so I'm just going to take you on a journey here through what has been a little bit of an adventure for these Wild D pairings over the last couple of games. So we go back to the Hurricanes game and looking at what Brett put together. in these cards. We start with the top line D pairing for the Minnesota Wilds. And that was that night against the Hurricanes. It was Alex Goligoski and Jared Spurgeon. Now, Goligoski was a negative .03 in the player performance cards. The expected goals for percentage with him on the ice was 52.2%. And again, expected goals for percentage is not necessarily the best metric for defenders. It's basically just the percentage of time when a goal is scored that it's your team scoring the goal. So Alex Goligoski's PCS rating from Brett Marshall was a negative .03. So slightly below zero. And his defense partner, Jared Spurgeon, was a 1.34. So Spurgeon was the best defender of the night against the Hurricanes. Jonas, Brodin, and Matt Dumba, both in positive territory. Brodin was a .87. Dumba was a 1.07. Then you look at John Merrill and Dmitry Kulikov. Merrill was a 1.11. Kulikov was a .45. But again, both in positive territory. Let's take a look at what has happened since. And again, keep in mind, Matt Dumba subtracted from the rotation due to injury, and Jordie Benn added in. Now, also of note, I think if this is going to be a long-term injury for Dumba, the Wild's top choice obviously would be to call up Calen Addison. He is also injured at the moment. So the Wild's in a little bit of a bind, but I think as soon as one of them is ready to come back, that becomes a pretty easy choice. Brett's cards from the 7-4 win against Detroit. This is the first time that we saw the Brodin-Spurgeon pairing. Brodin was a 1.23, second highest defenseman for the Wild. Spurgeon was a 5.04, which is far and away the top performer on defense for the Wilds, and is just an unbelievably good game for a defenseman. We saw the Merrill Kulikov line as the second pairing, and Merrill was a .83, so he was in positive territory. Kulikov was a .67, so in positive territory, both of those guys comfortable out there on the ice as they have been all season. Alex Goligoski was a negative 2.02. Jordie Benn was a negative 1.24. So both of that pairing with Goligoski and Benn, a problem. We move to the next shift that we saw in D pairings. Again, we see Brodin and Spurgeon on the top line. And this was tonight's performance against the Jets. Brodin was a 4.19, Spurgeon a 4.43. Only two defenders in positive territory in Brett's rankings. John Merrill and Alex Goligoski was a minus 2.14, Goligoski a minus 2.62, Kulikov a minus 0.48, Jordie Benn a minus 1.52. Obviously, Spurgeon and Brodin are going to be good together because they're good when they're on the ice. Jordie Benn is not. And I know I'm going to give full credit here because Ben has had moments where he has been serviceable on the ice this year. But that has been as a bottom pairing guy or as a fill-in whose minutes have been limited this season. The numbers speak for themselves. The performance on the ice speaks for itself. I understand trying to have a dominant top-line D pairing that you can throw at opponents, but at what cost? You have to level out the D pairings for this Wild team because putting Jordie Benn with Alex Goligoski or Dmitry Kulikov is not fair to them because there's just too much ice to cover. There's too much of a liability with Ben paired with those guys. So go back to what you had with Kulikov and Merrill, because those guys have played together and have developed that continuity and that chemistry. Keep that as the third line pairing. Substitute out Brodin's partner. If you have to play Jordie Benn, play him with Brodin, because at least he gets a little protection there. And you're not asking John Merrill or Dmitry Kulikov to do the Jonas Brodin. Put Jordie Benn with Jonas Brodin. Put Alex Goligoski with Jared Spurgeon. I'm begging you, get back to the normal D pairings and just even out the talent on those D pairings so that we don't see a performance like we saw against the Jets, because that was not good. And, some of that falls on Talbot. Some of those goals are goals that you'd like to see your goalie not give up. But you got Jordie Benn camped out in front of the net on a couple of those instances, and he is not able to do anything to assist, to try to get the puck out from in front of the net, or to help try to prevent the puck from going into the net. So that's a big change that I would make going forward. And we don't know how long Dumba's going to be out, but spread it out. You don't put bread on one half of the toast. You don't put 6 tablespoons of butter on one piece of bread. Spread it out. Spread it out. And so that's the big tweak that I would make going into Friday and beyond. There are a couple of other tweaks that the Wilds can make just in mentality going forward. And we'll talk about those to finish up today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. And again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. Make sure to check out Olympic Hockey Daily, presented by Locked On NHL, a bonus podcast covering all the action in Beijing. You can find it on the Locked On NHL podcast feed. It is free and available wherever you listen to podcasts, just like Locked On Wild as well. So make sure to give us a follow and follow us on social media as well to stay up to date on all things Minnesota Wild. So an interesting point in the game against the Jets, because it's something we've seen all season long, is the Wild's got to respond. They're down 2-1 after a lackluster second period. And, you hear Nico Sturm give the interview during the intermission. And when asked what the team needs to do to come back from another deficit, he hit it right on the head, although the team didn't necessarily do it. He said, we got to start playing better in these situations. We got a ton of games coming up, and we got to get ourselves into a better situation so that we don't have to complete the comeback every night. It's nice to have the fun, exciting comebacks, the multiple goal deficits that are erased, and some of that, especially come playoff time, some of that is very helpful, so that you don't ever get to the situation where you feel like you're out of a game and you have to kind of flush it and try for the next one. But something that you really can't make a habit is finding yourself down in the third period by multiple goals. You go to Colorado, you go to Vegas, you go to Florida, you go to Tampa Bay, you go to Toronto, you name it. You go to any one of those places and you find yourself down by 2 goals in the third period. That's a tough hill to dig out of. And so that speaks to just trying to play better in the first and second period. And that's just kind of a mentality thing. And, it was on display against the Jets, in which this team, they got the 1-0 lead. And it seemed like, for whatever reason, they just kind of took the foot off. And they allowed Winnipeg to dictate the way that the game was going to be played. It wasn't an overly physical game with Marcus Foligno back in, which I think was a surprise to a lot of people. There was the hit on Matt Boldy that sent him face first into the boards that I think riled a lot of people up. But this wasn't an overly physical game. And so maybe part of it was that the Wild came in anticipating that it was going to just be this slugfest, in that they were going to have to fight their way out of town to come away with the win in this game. And when Winnipeg didn't do it, they didn't know how to adjust at that point. And I'm still learning about the game of hockey myself, so I suppose that is an explanation for what we saw. But at the end of the day, something that this team has done so well against a lot of opponents below them in the standings is taking 1-0, making it 2, taking 2-0, making it 3. Never kind of easing up on your opponent. And this is a teachable moment. This is a teachable lesson for this team going forward, that this is a good example of what happens when you have a game that's winnable and you don't finish. You don't do those things you need to do in order to take it from 1-0 to 2 and 2 to 3 and so on and so on. So at the end of the day, it's not the end of the world. It is an instance where we can look at this game and we can say, here are some things we'd fix, because that game on Friday is going to be a grind against the Florida Panthers, who just survived the Carolina Hurricanes and came back to win in overtime. And if the Wild play like they did against Winnipeg, it's going to be a problem. But another thing that this team has done really well is bounce back. And so with the class of opponent coming to the XL Energy Center, with the fact that there are going to be a lot of people with eyes on what's going on Friday night at the X, I have full confidence that this team is going to bounce back and look better than they did in the second and third periods, second and part of the third period, because there was the stretch in the third period where the Wild were just relentless. But again, going back to kind of the other point that we made, it came about too late. It came about too late because at the time that it happened, Winnipeg had the ability to just answer everything that the Wild did. So do some of that from the get-go. Come out of the gate swinging. Come out of the gate with just a full head of steam, and let's see some of those 2-goal deficits turn into 2-goal advantages heading into the third period as this season goes, because there are going to be plenty of opportunities here down the stretch. There are a ton of games left, and so this Wild team still has plenty of room to continue to perform well and to continue to grow also. So let's use this as a teachable moment and an opportunity to learn from this mistake and move on through the rest of the season. And that is going to wrap it up for today's episode of Locked On Wild. So now that your first listen of the day is done, make sure to head over to the Locked On NHL podcast to get up to date on all things NHL from your favorite Locked On NHL hosts. Locked On NHL is free and available wherever you listen to podcasts. Just like Locked On Wild, you can find us wherever you listen, anytime you want to listen. All you have to do is search Locked On Wild to find us on various podcast platforms and on social media as well. We are keeping you as up to date as possible on all things Minnesota Wild, so that if big news or a puck drop anywhere here in the state of hockey, Locked On Wild has you covered with new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.